The only sound in the room was the steady scrape-shish of a whetstone against his knife. He moved his hand in a slow circle, focusing on the edge of the steel. In the mountains, a sharp blade was more than just a tool. It was the difference between staying alive and giving up. He wasn't thinking about anything special, just the rhythm of the work and the way the fire crackled to keep the winter at bay. He had grown used to the silence. He even liked it. It was a choice he made every day, pretending that being alone was exactly what he wanted. Then a noise broke the peace. It was a knock. It wasn't loud or angry. It was soft and unsure, like someone asking a question they were afraid to hear the answer to. Silas stopped moving. His hand stayed tight on the knife. He didn't get visitors. Out here, a knock usually meant someone was bringing bad news or looking for a fight. He waited, his heart beating a little faster against his ribs. A second knock came, and then a third, even weaker than the first. It sounded like the person on the other side was using the very last bit of their strength just to touch the wood. Silas stood up slowly, reaching for his rifle. He knew that in these peaks, desperation was never a good sign. Silas opened the door, and the cold mountain wind pushed its way inside. Standing there was a woman who looked like she was made of ice. Her face was a pale stone-gray color, and snow was stuck to her eyelashes and the thin cloth around her shoulders. Behind her stood two small children. The boy, who looked about 10 years old, had his arm wrapped tightly around a younger girl to keep her from the wind. They weren't wearing enough clothes for a storm like this, and their bodies were shaking so hard they could barely stay upright. The woman didn't say a word. Her lips were cracked and red from the frost, and her eyes were filled with a mix of deep shame and a tiny, dying bit of hope. Silas looked at the shivering children and then back at the mother. He didn't ask who they were or what they wanted yet. The freezing air was already stealing the heat from his cabin. He simply stepped to the side to let them in. The woman didn't say a word. Her lips were cracked and red from the frost, and her eyes were filled with a mix of deep shame and a tiny, dying bit of hope. Silas looked at the shivering children and then back at the mother. He didn't ask who they were or what they wanted yet. The freezing air was already stealing the heat from his cabin. He simply stepped to the side to let them in. As soon as she crossed the wooden floor, the woman's legs gave out. It was like she had used every last drop of energy just to reach his door. Silas moved quickly, catching her by the arm before she hit the ground. The boy led his little sister inside, his eyes wide and full of fear as he watched this stranger help his mother. Silas kicked the door shut against the howling snow, feeling the heavy weight of the woman in his arms. She felt as light and thin as a sack of flour. Silas moved with a purpose that didn't leave room for many words. He tossed thick furs onto the floor by the fire, and the children sank into them immediately. He lifted the woman, Clara, into a chair and handed her a cup of hot water. Her hands shook so much the water almost spilled. Silas didn't ask a long list of questions. He knew that warm skin and full bellies mattered more than curiosity right now. He went to a back room and pulled out old clothes he had kept for years, a heavy wool shirt, warm socks, and a dress that had belonged to his mother. He handed them over and told them simply to get dry first and talk later. He even stepped outside into the stinging snow for a few minutes to give the woman privacy to change. When he came back inside, the cabin smelled of the rabbit stew he had been cooking. The scent was so strong it made the boy's stomach growl. Silas filled 3 bowls and told them to eat. They ate in total silence, focusing on every bite as if they were afraid the food might disappear. While they ate, Silas did the math in his head. Clara told him they had been walking since Monday. That meant they had spent 5 whole days out in the freezing storm. He looked at their small faces, now turning pink from the heat of the fire, and nodded once.
He told her she had done the right thing by finding him.
Once the children had finished their food and the warmth of the fire had settled in, Clara finally spoke. Her voice was shaky as she told Silas about the life they had lost. Her husband had died back in the spring from a fever, leaving her to handle their land alone. She had tried her best to keep things going through the summer, but the dirt went dry and no one would give her a job because she had kids to look after. Then the winter hit harder and earlier than anyone expected. The heavy snows piled up until the roof of their small cabin literally snapped and broke, leaving them with no shelter and nowhere to go. Silas listened in silence, realizing that these three weren't just people who had taken a wrong turn in the woods. They were survivors who had lost everything they ever owned. As Clara talked about walking through the deep snow with nothing but her children's hands in hers, Silas felt a strange shift inside himself. For years he had kept his cabin as a place to hide away from the world, but now it was something different. It was the only thing standing between this family and the end of their story. Just as Silas started to relax, the sound of hooves crunching in the snow cut through the quiet night. He stood up instantly, his hand finding the familiar weight of his rifle. Outside, two men on strong, healthy horses stepped out from the trees. These horses were well-fed and powerful, which was a sharp contrast to the starving, shivering family hiding inside the cabin. Men didn't ride this far into the mountains by mistake. They came with a reason, and usually that reason involved trouble. Silas stepped onto the porch, leaning against the doorframe with his gun held across his chest. He didn't say a word, using his silence to make the men feel uneasy. The tall rider spoke first, his voice sounding smooth and fake, like someone pretending to be a friend. He claimed they were just looking for warmth, but his eyes were searching the cabin. When Silas told them to keep moving, the man's fake smile disappeared. He admitted they were looking for a woman and two children who belonged to them. Silas lied and told them he hadn't seen a soul in weeks. The men didn't believe him, but they weren't ready to fight just yet. Before riding away, the tall man looked Silas in the eye and promised they would be back, warning him that there were very few places to hide in these mountains. Silas watched them disappear into the dark trees, knowing that the peace in his home was about to be broken. The next morning, the cabin felt different. It was no longer just a cold place where one man lived alone. It was starting to feel like a real home. Silas spent the morning outside with Leo, teaching the boy how to hold a small axe and split wood into thin pieces to start the fire. Leo worked hard, not saying much, but watching Silas closely to learn how to do things right. Inside, Clara was busy too. She scrubbed the cooking pot, fixed a tear in the old curtains, and cleaned up the dust from the corners that Silas had ignored for years. Even the little girl, Maisie, found some wooden animals Silas had carved long ago and played with them by the hearth. As the sun began to go down, the mood changed from busy to serious. Silas went to an old wooden chest and pulled out 2 heavy handguns. He checked the bullets and put one on the table, telling Clara that the men would be back soon and they would bring more help this time. While they sat by the low fire, Clara asked Silas if he thought God really saw people like them, or even cared what happened to them out in the middle of nowhere. Silas thought about it for a long time before answering. He told her he believed God sees the people who cry when no one else is around to hear them, and that God had definitely seen her. It was a quiet moment of peace, but it didn't last long. Suddenly, the dogs outside started barking loudly, warning them that the danger had arrived. As the sun began to go down, the mood changed from busy to serious. Silas went to an old wooden chest and pulled out 2 heavy handguns. He checked the bullets and put one on the table,
telling Clara that the men would be back soon and they would bring more help this time. While they sat by the low fire, Clara asked Silas if he thought God really saw people like them, or even cared what happened to them out in the middle of nowhere. Silas thought about it for a long time before answering. He told her he believed God sees the people who cry when no one else is around to hear them, and that God had definitely seen her. It was a quiet moment of peace, but it didn't last long. Suddenly, the dogs outside started barking loudly, warning them that the danger had arrived.
The lanterns moved through the trees like hungry eyes, swaying slowly as the men approached the cabin. Silas didn't waste any time. He lowered the fire to hide their shadows and told Clara and the children to get down into the cellar. He watched as Leo led his little sister through the trap door, with Clara following close behind. Silas covered the door with a heavy rug and a fur to keep them hidden. Then he grabbed his rifles and waited by the window. A heavy knock hit the door. 3 loud strikes that sounded like a threat. A man's voice called out, claiming that Clara's husband had owed them a debt and that they were here to take the little girl as payment. Silas felt a hot anger rise up in him. He told them flatly that they weren't taking anyone. Suddenly, the quiet night was ripped apart by the sound of gunfire. Bullets cracked into the wooden door and shattered the glass of the windows, filling the air with smoke and splinters. Silas dropped low and fired back, his hands steady just like his father's would have been. One man tried to climb through a broken window, but Silas shot him in the shoulder and sent him tumbling back into the snow. He moved from wall to wall, defending the home with everything he had, proving he wasn't just a tired old man. He was a fighter, protecting what was right. After the gunfire stopped, a deep voice called out from the darkness. A man named Elias Blackwood stepped forward, lowered his rifle, and agreed to leave. He saw that Silas was not going to give up, and he respected the strength Silas showed in protecting the cabin. The lanterns slowly faded into the trees, and the mountain became quiet again. Silas opened the cellar door and helped Clara and the children climb out. As they stood in the middle of the room, Leo suddenly stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Silas's waist. Silas froze for a second, his body stiff because he wasn't used to anyone trusting him or touching him like that. But then he slowly placed a hand on the boy's back.
In the days that followed, the cabin changed forever. It was no longer a cold place where a man hid from the world. It was a home filled with life. One evening, while sitting by the fire, Silas quietly admitted that he never had a wife because he didn't think he would be good at it. Clara looked at him with kindness and told him he just never had the chance to know for sure until now. For the first time in many winters, Silas looked around his home and realized the silence was gone. The air didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full. And the lonely mountain man finally understood that he was no longer alone.